2 months, 2 women who quit, an abandoned father on his knees in the mud. Nobody could calm those twins, until the orc girl the village had humiliated and rejected walked into the farmhouse and the crying stopped. What happened next, nobody in the village saw coming. But to understand how she got there, we have to go back, months before, to the world that made her leave in the first place. The iron borderlands had a specific smell. Old smoke, wet earth, and the kind of tension that seeps into wood over decades. It was the smell of a place that had seen war and was still deciding whether it was over. 12 years after the Treaty of the Northern Marks, peace existed on paper and in few places beyond that. The war had ended without a winner. 2 exhausted peoples who stopped killing each other because the price had grown too high for both sides. The borders were redrawn, the clans returned to their lands, and the speeches talked of a new era. But a paper border does not erase what was done in flesh. In the villages along the banks of the Tescan River, doors still closed too fast when a green-skinned figure appeared in the street. A child would spot one from a window and pull back the curtain as if that alone could undo what their eyes had seen. Men crossed to the other side of the road without looking up. Women pulled their children closer without explaining why, and the children learned the gesture before they ever learned the reason behind it. In the more distant places, there were rumors of clandestine slavery. Orcs captured for forced labor, far from the eyes of the council and the treaty that nobody truly enforced. Caravans that arrived in the capital with one fewer traveler than when they'd departed, debts paid in bodies. But in the morning markets, in the stalls nearest the eastern roads, something else was also beginning. Slowly, the way stubborn things grow, human merchants who traded with orc suppliers, children who had grown up after the war, who had never held a sword against anyone, who sometimes looked across the border with curiosity instead of fear. A world was changing. It was doing so quietly, reluctantly, as if ashamed of its own progress. Arzana was 22 years old and carried a specific kind of exhaustion, the kind that belongs to someone who grew up hearing about war and no longer wanted even the word. She had been born 3 years before the treaty. She had no memory of the killing, only of the silence left behind it, a silence that everyone around her filled with grief, with rage, with the kind of stories that keep hatred alive long after the swords go cold. She did not want to be a warrior. She did not want to carry the weight of the clan on her back as if it were inherited destiny. She wanted honest work, a roof earned with her own hands, a place where no one looked at her and saw an enemy. She had watched older orcs who left for the borderlands and came back changed, not broken, but different, quieter in a new way, as if they had touched something the clan hadn't reached yet. She wanted to go meet that world before it passed without warning. She left at dawn with a leather pack and copper coins for a week. She told no one a specific destination because she didn't have one. What she had was a direction, west, toward the Tescan, toward the places where the 2 peoples had begun to share the same market, the same well, the same road, without either of them pretending it was entirely comfortable. A direction was enough. The first day, the road was empty and long. The sky was the color of iron filings. The second day, a trader passed her heading east and gave her a nod, not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement. She counted it. The third day, the forest thickened on both sides, and she slept curled against a boulder with the pack under her head, listening to the trees settle. The fourth day brought the mercenaries, 3 men on horseback. They appeared around the bend of the trail as if they had been waiting there all morning, which they likely had. Arzana recognized the type before she saw the insignia, not common bandits. Bandits wanted silver. These men had the posture of catchers, the particular stillness of people who had learned to be patient, because patience was part of the job. She had heard about them in the clan lands, men who delivered orcs alive to labor camps, far from the treaty's reach, in places where the council's documents were only paper and paper burns easily. She touched the sides of her horse, and they came after her. The chase cut through the forest along the Tescan's edge, branches whipping her arms, the uneven ground threatening to bring everything down at once. She kept her eyes forward. Behind her the hooves were heavy and close, closer than she wanted. She needed 1 second of advantage, just one. And then she saw the grotto, a narrow passage between rock and root, the kind that blocks the view of whoever follows for just a few moments. She calculated it fast, let go of the reins, threw herself from the horse in motion, rolled into the shadow of the rock, while the animal kept going down the trail on its own. The mercenaries passed without stopping, following the horse, as she had counted on. She pressed herself flat against the stone and did not move. She could hear them in the distance, voices, then silence, then nothing. She waited longer than she thought necessary. A mercenary who gives up too fast sometimes hasn't given up at all. When she finally moved, she went the opposite direction. Found the hollow oak half buried in the hill, ancient, rotted out, smelling of wet earth and old decay. She crawled inside. The darkness was total. She lay still and listened to her own heartbeat slow, 1 beat at a time, until the forest outside returned to the silence of something that was not listening for her anymore. She stayed in the trunk through the rest of the afternoon and into the dark edge of evening. When she came out, she was stiff and cold, and the copper coins in her pack felt heavier than before. But she was unhurt. She picked a direction by the stars and began walking. 1 full day of travel later, she saw the village. It was small, a cluster of stone buildings around a central well, smoke from 3 chimneys, a tavern with a lantern out front that had been burning so long the glass was dark with soot. She entered with her head up, trying not to look like what she was, an orc, alone, without a horse, with mud to her knees. A woman closed the window. A man turned his back before she opened her mouth. At the tavern, the owner said there was no room and no work without properly looking at her at all. She thanked him in a low voice and walked out. The village had nothing for her. She kept moving. 10 minutes past the last building, the farm appeared between 2 old oak trees. Stone house, thatched roof, barn, a fenced garden, a wooden gate that needed repair. She passed in front of it with no intention of stopping. But she stopped. Something about that place held her gaze for a second, the human proportion of things, the smoke curling from the chimney, the small, ordinary signs of a life being maintained. It was exactly in that second that she heard the crying. 2 babies, simultaneous, desperate in that specific way that is not just discomfort but something deeper, the sound of children who have been crying so long that crying has become the only language they trust. Then the door opened, and a large man came running into the yard. He was broad-shouldered, with the hands of someone who works with a hoe, and he moved like someone running toward something that couldn't be fixed by running. He reached the middle of the muddy yard and went to his knees, covered his face. His shoulders shook. Azana stood at the gate and watched. The crying from inside the house continued. The man did not get up. She pushed the gate open. He heard her footsteps and looked up. His eyes were red, not just from the moment, but from weeks of not sleeping correctly. He stared at her the way people stare at something they don't have the energy left to categorize. She said, "How old are they?" It took him a moment. 7 months. How long has this been going on? Since their mother left, 2 months ago. She looked at the house, then back at him. "Do you want help or not?" He got to his feet slowly. He was a full head taller than her and probably weighed twice as much, and he looked at her with an expression that was not suspicion exactly. It was the look of someone who has passed through suspicion and come out the other side into something more like desperate pragmatism. "Can you handle children?" "I can handle most things," she said. His name was Eldar. He told her the rest in the kitchen, while the twins wailed in the next room. His wife had gone 2 months ago, left with a passing merchant, left the twins at 5 months old, and the farm without explanation. He had tried to hire help from the village. The first woman lasted a day, the second lasted 3, and left crying without being able to explain why. He had been alone since. He said all of it without drama, in the voice of someone who had moved past embarrassment. Then he asked again, "Have you cared for children before?" "Younger siblings," she said. 4 of them. He looked at her for a moment, then he stepped aside from the bedroom door. The twins hit her like a wall of sound. Eldarion and Faramir were 7 months old, and they screamed with a synchrony that seemed rehearsed for maximum despair. The room smelled of milk and damp cloth, and the particular staleness of a space where sleep had not been happening properly. She took it in without slowing. She went to Eldarion first, the one nearest to her. She picked him up with wide, firm hands, the way she had learned to hold things that were frightened, not tight but certain, completely certain. No hesitation. The baby froze mid-scream for one astonished second, as if he had never been held quite that way before, as if the certainty itself was something new. She began to hum, low, rhythmic, a song from the Orc lands. Not a lullaby exactly, more of a working song, the kind sung while moving grain, while walking long distances, while doing things that required patience and repetition. It had no words. It had only the sound of something that knows it will continue. Faramir stopped crying before she even picked him up. She shifted Eldarion to one arm and reached for Faramir with the other, held them both, kept humming. The sound filled the small room the way a fire fills a cold space, not violently, but completely. Eldar stood in the doorway with an expression she would come to know well over the following months. The look of someone witnessing something he could not explain and was not going to insult by trying. For the first time in 2 months, the room went quiet. They stood there, the 2 of them silent on opposite ends of the world, the 2 babies warm and still in her arms, the lamp burning low on the table. Outside, the iron borderlands wind moved through the oaks with the sound it had always made, indifferent to treaties and their consequences. It did not know that something small was beginning in this room. Most beginnings happen that way. She looked down at the 2 small faces, Eldarion watching her with dark, serious eyes, Faramir already drifting, his fist curled against his own cheek. She kept humming. There was nothing else required of her in this moment, and that simplicity felt like something she had not found in a long time. Behind her, she heard Eldar let out a long, slow breath, the sound of a man setting down a weight he had forgotten he was carrying. The arrangement made itself roof and food in exchange for care of the children and work on the farm. Nothing in silver, nothing signed. The kind of barter that in the iron borderlands carries the weight of a contract because it is made eye to eye. She slept in the barn that first night. In the morning, she was at the stove before Eldar came downstairs. He found warm porridge, 2 babies with full bellies, and the silence he had forgotten how to live without. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. In the days that followed, she repaired the hinge on the gate, treated the blight on the garden, reorganized the barn. She did things without asking permission and without needing praise. She simply did them, the way someone does things when they have decided a place matters and are acting accordingly. Meanwhile, across the road and through the village, things were different. The smith's wife had seen the Orc girl carrying water from the well that first morning. She told the miller told the tavern keeper. By the second day there was a specific kind of tension in the village, not the open hostility of the war years, but something more careful and watchful, the kind that waits to see what will happen before committing to a position. The smith himself said nothing. He was practical before he was prejudiced, and he had been watching the farm for months, with the specific concern of a neighbor who had seen things deteriorating and had not known what to do about it. The first woman lasted a day, The second lasted 3. The children never stopped screaming. He had heard them on cold mornings when the wind came from the right direction. He was not a man who talked about his feelings, but he kept his rifle oiled and his door unlocked, in the way that men in the iron borderlands did when they felt something unresolved nearby. He heard nothing this morning. He picked up his tongs and went back to work. Back at the farm, Arzana had found a routine, and routine was what she understood best. Up before the light, fire before the cold, food before the hunger. The twins had a rhythm she was already learning. Which cry was hunger, which was tiredness, which was Faramir wanting attention because his brother had been held first. She mapped them the way she had always mapped things, by repetition, by patience, by refusing to be surprised. Eldar worked the land through the day and came in at evening quieter than the day before. Not because he had less to say. She had the sense he was a man who had plenty inside him, but because something in the house had shifted, and he was still adjusting to it. She understood that. Change takes time to settle, even when it is welcome. The twins, for their part, had made their position clear from the second day. Eldarion reached for her every morning with the gravity of a small king making a just demand. Faramir shouted the closest sound to her name he could produce whenever he saw her move toward the door. They did not care what she was. They only knew what she did. 1 month in, Arzana knew every rhythm of the farm and every rhythm of the twins. Eldar noticed the way people notice important things, not all at once, but in layers. The afternoon she anticipated the rain and covered the firewood before he remembered. The night she stayed up with a feverish Eldarion without anyone asking, and he came downstairs at 2 in the morning to find her in the rocking chair with the baby on her chest. The lamp turned down, both of them breathing quietly. The morning he found the coffee ready and the twins laughing on their blanket on the floor. Something changed in the way he looked at her. Nothing said. Just there. The village was changing too. Not quickly, and not completely, but in the small, reluctant way that things change when reality keeps contradicting the assumption. The smith was the first to greet her at the market, because his best horse had gone lame, and she had known what to do when no one else had offered anything useful. He had thanked her with a single nod, and she had accepted it the same way. The miller's wife stopped avoiding her gaze. The village children who had been spying through the fence began accepting oat biscuits through the gate slats without running. Not full acceptance, not warmth, but different from what it had been, and different for now, was enough. What the village did not notice, because it did not look that closely, was that Eldar had started sleeping again. Not just falling into exhaustion, but actually sleeping, the kind of sleep that restores. He came to the table in the mornings with something in his face that had not been there before. Not happiness exactly. More like a man who had been holding his breath for months and had finally remembered he was allowed to exhale. The twins turned 8 months old. Then 9, then 10. Eldarion grew quieter and more observant. He would sit perfectly still watching a spider build a web in the corner of the barn for an astonishing length of time. Faramir grew louder and more impulsive, throwing his arms wide when excited, crashing into things with complete confidence that the world would catch him. They were entirely different and utterly inseparable, and they were entirely, obviously, hers. Not by blood or paper or any formal arrangement, by the only thing that had ever counted in this farmhouse, by showing up day after day and staying. It was an ordinary afternoon, when the news reached the village first, and then the farm. Someone passing through had told someone who told the blacksmith's boy, who told the miller, who told the smith himself. And by the time it reached Eldar's gate, it had travelled through enough mouths that the details were both sharpened and blurred. The woman who had left the twins had heard from someone who had passed through and talked too much, that her former husband was keeping an orc girl in the house to care for her children. And she was furious. The smith came himself. He arrived at the farm direct and without ceremony, because that was who he was, and said what he knew without softening it. The woman was coming. She had said she would come to take the children back. Eldar stood in the middle of the yard when the smith finished talking. He looked at the house, at the window where he could see the shadow of movement, Arzana moving through the kitchen, the sound of the twins banging something with their hands because they had discovered that things made noise when hit. He looked at all of that for a moment. Then he went inside. He did not say what the smith had told him. He sat down at the table and watched Arzana feed the twins their evening porridge, and he thought about what he would say when it arrived. He thought about it all night. He lay in the dark with the house quiet around him and listened to the farm settling into itself and the distant sound of the Tescan, and he decided, in the specific, wordless way decisions get made at 2 in the morning, what he was and was not willing to do. In the morning he came down and told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "And what do you want to do?" He looked at her. "Keep things as they are." She looked at him for a moment. "Then that's what we'll do." The next 2 days were quiet in a way that felt occupied, like the quiet before weather, when everything is still and nothing is still. She continued the routine: fire, food, the twins, the farm. She mended a section of fence. She taught Eldarion to splash water with his hands in the basin, which became the best thing that had ever happened to him. She watched the road in the mornings from the corner of her eye and said nothing about it. She knew the waiting would not last. On the 4th morning after the news, Mira arrived early, when the mist was still on the field. She did not come alone. She came with her new husband, a well-dressed man with the posture of someone who had money and had learned to let others know it, and 3 armed men with the particular bearing of those hired not to ask questions. She was well-dressed herself, and she wore the expression of someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say. She said she had rights over her children, that she was the mother, that whatever had happened between her and Eldar was a matter between them, and no orc had anything to do with it. She said it to Eldar, who had come out to the gate, and she said it clearly, with the confidence of someone who expects the argument to end there. Eldar said, in a low and even voice, that she had left when the boys were 5 months old, that she was not going to arrive now and take them anywhere. She said she would. She said it, turned, and left to gather more men. She had the posture of someone with a plan that included more than one step. Eldar stood at the gate after she was gone. Behind him, Arzana stood in the doorway of the house with both twins on her arms, the door still open, the morning still and cold around her. They looked at each other across the yard. He said, "Tomorrow." She nodded once. Then she went back inside. That night, she bathed the twins and sang them the working song, the one without words, the one about continuing. Eldarion fell asleep with her thumb in his fist. Faramir fell asleep looking at her face with the absolute peace of a child who does not know what is coming and trusts completely that whatever does, she will be there. She sat with them for a long time after they were asleep. The lamp burned low. The wind moved through the oaks. She did not allow herself to think about the next morning. Not the numbers, not the odds, not what it would mean if things went wrong. She thought about the working song. She thought about the way Eldarion always reached for her first. She thought about how Faramir had learned to say something that was almost her name. She thought, this is what I came for. Not this moment, maybe, but this. They came back the next morning when the fog still covered the field. 6 this time. The new husband, the 3 armed men, and 2 more gathered along the way. They walked through the gate without asking. Eldar came out with his staff and stood in front of the door. Inside, Arzana held both twins with the door closed behind her. She could hear the voices outside, rising sharp at the edges. Eldarion sensed the tension and began to whimper. She pressed him closer and kept her breathing even so he could feel it. Outside, one of the armed men stepped toward the house. Another moved toward the barn. They were surrounding the yard. Eldar was alone in the middle of it all. But he was not alone. The smith had seen the group pass through the village's main road, outside men, armed in number, heading in the direction of the farm. He had understood before he finished thinking. He went out calling to others. The miller came. Old Drev came, the tavern keeper came, neighbours came, men who had known Eldar since before his sons were born, men who had watched the farm struggle before she arrived and had not known what to do, and who now knew exactly what to do. When 15 men from the village arrived on the road, with rifles and tools in their hands, the 6 in the farmyard understood that the calculation had changed. They stopped. The smith walked to the front and said, without raising his voice, that this farm had the village behind it, and it would be better for everyone if they left while the morning was still young. That was when Mira pushed past the men and shoved the door open. She reached for Faramir, grabbed for the boy with both hands. He screamed with shock and clung to Arzana's neck with both arms. Arzana took him back in one firm movement. Then she stepped forward until she was close enough that Mira could not look away from her face. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She spoke in the voice she used with the twins when they needed to understand something true. She said, "A mother does not abandon a 5-month-old child to leave with another man." She said, "A mother stays. A mother loses sleep. A mother holds the crying." She said that these children had suffered, and that Mira was not going to arrive here after months and take what she had put down as if it was still hers to pick up. The yard went silent. Mira stood still for a moment with the expression of someone searching for a response and finding nothing. Her new husband put his hand on her shoulder. He said quietly that it was time to go. The armed men were already stepping back. 15 men of the village with rifles and iron in their hands is a language that speaks clearly and requires no translation. Mira looked at Eldar one last time. Something crossed her face that was difficult to name. Not regret, not rage, but perhaps the weight of understanding what she had left. Then she turned. The gate closed. The hoofbeats moved away down the road until the silence came back. Eldar stood in the yard with his eyes closed for a long moment. The village men left the way they had arrived, without speeches, without waiting for thanks. The smith tapped Eldar on the shoulder once as he passed and said that next time he should call first. Eldar nodded without finding words. Inside, Arzana had already put the twins on their blanket on the floor. She was kneeling beside them, speaking low, the working song again. The one that meant nothing except continuance. Eldarion had his fingers wrapped around the sleeve of her shirt. Faramir had his face buried in her lap, still trembling slightly from the fright. She held them until the breathing of both boys went slow and heavy with sleep. She did not move after that. She stayed on the floor, with her back against the wall, and the twins against her, and listened to the farm settle back into itself. The wind in the oaks, the distant water, the quiet that was not the quiet before something but the quiet that comes after. Later, Eldar made coffee, 2 cups without asking. He set one on the window ledge and held the other at the table. The lamp was low, and the wind outside was the constant northern sound it always made. They sat in a silence that did not need filling. Then he said, "Thank you." Not with the voice of someone completing a formality, but with the voice of someone who has been carrying something a long time and has finally found the right moment to put it down. Arzana looked at her cup. She said she was the one who was grateful. He frowned. She said, "It was the first time I stayed anywhere." He sat with that for a moment. Then he stood and crossed the room and held her. No ceremony, no explanation, with the plain firmness of someone saying something that has no better word. She went rigid for a second, the old reflex of someone who learned early that unexpected contact usually precedes a problem. Then her shoulders came down. She held him back. They stood like that for a moment in the kitchen silence, the coffee cooling on the ledge, the twins asleep in the next room. It was not a promise. It was not a declaration. It was 2 tired people who had come through something hard together and needed one moment to breathe. 4 years later, the farm had a different rhythm, the rhythm of a place with real life inside it. The garden had doubled in size. The barn had been rebuilt with new timber. The gate no longer groaned on its hinge. On an autumn morning with the sun still low, Arzana sat on the porch with a mug of hot tea, watching Eldarion and Faramir run through the field of hay that Eldar had been trying to cut for 2 days. Or had been trying to cut, because the boys had turned the work into a battle of hay-pile forts that showed no sign of ending. Faramir was chasing his brother with a fistful of hay when his foot found a dip in the ground he clearly had not seen. The fall was spectacular. A brief flight, an unplanned rotation, and then he disappeared into the hay pile he had been building all morning with a dull thud and a cloud of straw, a full second of silence. Then he lifted his head. His hair was entirely covered in hay, one strand going every direction, a piece hanging from his ear, his expression still processing what had just happened. Arzana laughed. Not the polite kind. The real kind, the kind that escapes before you can decide if you're going to laugh. From the roof, where he'd been nailing a loose tile, Eldar stopped his hammer, looked down, and started laughing too. The laughter of a father who tries to hold it and cannot. Eldarion stopped in the middle of the field, looked at his brother in the hay pile, looked at his father on the roof, looked at Arzana on the porch, and dissolved entirely, the full-body laughter of a child who uses everything he has. Faramir sat in his hay pile for one more moment with uncertain dignity. Then he started throwing hay in the air with both hands like it was a celebration. The morning filled with that sound. Eldar came down from the roof, still grinning, and walked through the field toward the boys. Eldarion ran to him before he arrived. Faramir tried to stand, slipped, went down again, another full round of laughter, and then made it to his feet and ran too. Eldar caught them both with one arm each, lifted them, and stood there in the middle of the field. He looked toward the porch. Arzana had come down the steps with the mug still in her hands, and the smile still on her face. When she reached them, he made space, and she stepped in. The 4 of them stood in the field with the morning light coming down and the hay still settling around Faramir's boots. No one spoke. Nothing needed saying. The farm went on around them the way it always had, the Tescan somewhere beyond the tree line, the oaks moving in the northern wind, the smoke starting from the chimney. Arzana had left the Orklands with a pack on her back and a simple idea. She had wanted to live, not just survive. She had wanted to find a place before it passed without warning. She had found it. It looked exactly like this. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.